There is a layer of rock in the Austrian Alps that does not belong. Everything around it is limestone. White, clean, orderly. Hundreds of millions of years of calcium carbonate laid down in warm, shallow seas. One thin sheet at a time. You could run your hand across it and feel nothing unusual. Just stone. Then your fingers hit something different. A band of dark sediment, maybe a few inches thick, cutting across the white like a scar. Silica-rich, almost black. The kind of deposit you find at the bottom of oxygen-starved water, where things die and sink and do not decay the way they should. In 1974, an Austrian geologist named Wolfgang Schlager stood at that rock face and wrote down what he saw. He gave it a name, the Rheingrabener Wende, German for something close to the Rheingraben turning point, a bureaucratic name for something he did not yet understand. He published that short paper. The field moved on. That dark layer sat in the scientific record for 15 years without an explanation. What Schlager did not know, what no one knew yet, was that he was not looking at a local anomaly. He was looking at a signal. The same dark interruption shows up in the Italian Dolomites, in sedimentary records from China, from Japan, from Argentina, from the floor of what was once a vast prehistoric ocean. Every one of them marks the same moment. Every one of them is asking the same question. What happened here? The answer is not a single event. It is not a flood in the way that word usually works. It is something stranger and larger, and in some ways more unsettling than a catastrophe you can point to on a map and name. It is what happens when a planet's climate breaks its own rules, when the sky stops behaving the way every living thing on Earth has built its existence around, when the rain comes and does not stop, and then, when it finally does stop, the world that is left behind is not the one that was there before. This is the story of that breaking point, of the world before it and the world after, of what was lost, what survived, and what one small creature running on two legs across a red desert in Argentina tells us about what it means to inherit a crisis you did not cause. To understand what the rain destroyed, you have to first understand what existed before it, not as a list of extinct species, not as a diagram in a textbook, as a world that was working, a world that had its own logic, its own rhythms, its own version of normal that had held together for millions of years before anyone thought to question it. The time is 234 million years ago. The period is the Triassic, specifically the stage that geologists call the Carnian. And the first thing you need to know about this world is that it is hot. Not warm, hot in a way that the human body has no reference point for. Hot in a way that rewrites what is possible for living things and what is not. Global temperatures are running somewhere between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius above what you experience today. The polar ice caps, to the extent they exist at all, are minimal. The oceans are warm enough that one researcher, describing the conditions of the late Triassic seas, used the phrase hot soup, not as hyperbole, as a reasonable characterization of the thermal state of the water, but the heat is only the beginning. Look at the geography, because the geography is the thing that makes everything else make sense. Every continent you know, every landmass that today is separated from every other by thousands of miles of open ocean, is still connected. The supercontinent Pangaea is in the late stages of its existence, beginning to pull apart at the edges, but its core is still intact. What will one day become North America is still attached to what will become Europe. What will become Africa is still joined to what will become South America. The Atlantic Ocean does not exist. The Indian Ocean does not exist. In their place is one enormous landmass surrounded by one enormous ocean, the Panthalassa, which covers more than half the planet. This geography does something specific to the climate. It creates an interior. When you have a supercontinent the size of Pangaea, the land in the middle is simply too far from the sea for ocean moisture to reach it reliably. The coastal regions get whatever rain the atmospheric circulation can deliver. But the interior, the vast central mass of rock and soil that stretches for thousands of miles in every direction, gets almost nothing. It bakes. It dries. It turns the color of rust. The rocks from this period tell the story directly. Geologists, working on Triassic strata across what is now Europe, North America, and Asia, find the same thing: red beds, oxidized sediment. The geological signature of dry conditions and high temperatures, spread across formation after formation like a record of a planet that has spent an extremely long time without adequate rain. This is not a new development by the Carnian. The Triassic as a whole is a dry period. It follows the catastrophe of the Permian-Triassic extinction, the event known as the Great Dying, which had concluded roughly 20 million years earlier and left the planet in a condition of ecological poverty that it is still, at this point in our story, working its way out of. The forests that once covered large portions of the land's surface had been devastated. The coal swamps that had been sequestering carbon for hundreds of millions of years collapsed and did not return for a very long time. The recovery of terrestrial plant life was slow, uneven, and never quite complete in the way that phrase might suggest. By the Carnian, plant life has recovered significantly. Ferns cover the ground in many regions. Horsetails crowd the edges of rivers and lakes. Conifers, the ancient ancestors of the pines and spruces and firs that cover mountain slopes today, have established themselves in highland areas and along river corridors. But the overall picture is still one of a world that is biologically simpler than what came before the Great Dying, and far simpler than what will come after. In this world, the dominant animals on land are not the ones you might expect. They are not dinosaurs. Not yet. Or rather, not in any meaningful sense. Dinosaurs exist in the Carnian, but they are rare. In the fossil assemblages recovered from this period, dinosaur remains represent somewhere around 5 to 6% of the total. They are present the way that something can be present without mattering, the way a minor character can appear in the first act of a story without anyone knowing yet what role they will eventually play. The animals that matter, the animals that fill the ecological roles and dominate the fossil record, are a group called rhynchosaurs, beaked, barrel-bodied, roughly the size of a large pig. Rhynchosaurs are herbivores specialized for processing the tough vegetation of the Triassic landscape. At many sites, their remains account for 40 to 60% of all the vertebrate fossils recovered. They are, by any ecological measure, the most successful large herbivores on the planet at this moment. Alongside them are dicynodonts, survivors of the Great Dying, animals that look something like a cross between a tortoise and a hippopotamus, that had been present on Earth since well before the extinction that killed most of their relatives. They are slower to recover their former diversity, but they are here, occupying the large-bodied herbivore niches that the landscape offers. The predators of this world are aetosaurs, armored and pig-snouted, rauisuchians, large and imposing, filling a role that large crocodilians will later occupy. And in the margins of these ecosystems, small and fast, and not yet important, The earliest dinosaurs move through a world that is not yet theirs. Pangaea has one more feature worth understanding before the story can move forward. It has weather, not the chaotic, regionally variable weather of a fragmented world, with multiple ocean basins and mountain ranges and coastlines creating different conditions in different places. Pangaea has something more unified and more extreme, what climate scientists call the Pangaean megamonsoon, when you have one supercontinent surrounded by one ocean. The seasonal contrast between land and sea temperatures becomes enormous. In summer, the land heats up faster and to higher temperatures than the surrounding ocean. Air rises over the hot land, and moist ocean air flows in to replace it from the coast, bringing seasonal rains to the margins of the continent. In winter, the pattern reverses. The land cools faster than the ocean, and dry continental air flows outward. The result is a monsoon system operating at a planetary scale. Intense seasonal rains along certain coastal regions, deep seasonal drought in the interior, a world of extremes that has been running on this basic rhythm for millions of years. Every living thing in the Carnian world has organized its existence around that rhythm. The rhynchosaurs time their reproduction to the rainy season. The conifers along the river corridors have root systems designed for the cycles of flood and drought. The small dinosaurs at the edges of the ecosystem have behaviors and physiologies shaped by the predictability of the Pangaean climate. Here is the thing about a system organized around predictability. It is very good at maintaining itself when conditions stay within the range it was built for. It is not built for what is coming. Somewhere in the middle of the Panthalassa, the great ocean that covers more than half of the planet, something is happening that nothing alive on the surface of the Earth can detect. There is no tremor that reaches land, no column of smoke visible from any shoreline, no change in the color of the water that a creature standing on a beach could observe and interpret as a warning. What is happening at depth, in darkness, under pressure that would reduce any surface-dwelling animal to nothing in seconds. The seafloor is moving, not in the way that tectonic plates move in the long geological sense. The slow drift of continents across millions of years. This is something more localized and more violent. A plume of superheated material from deep in the Earth's mantle is pushing upward against the underside of the oceanic crust. And the crust, which is thinner here than continental crust by a significant margin, is beginning to give way. What begins to emerge from the seafloor is not a single volcano. It is a province, a vast region of volcanic activity that will eventually produce millions of cubic kilometers of basalt, building layer upon layer of lava across an area so large that when the tectonic movements of the next 230 million years are done rearranging things, the rocks produced here will be found accreted onto the coastlines of Alaska and British Columbia. Geologists today call it the Wrangellia Large Igneous Province, named for the Wrangell Mountains, where some of its remnants are most clearly visible, in 234 million years before the present. It is just beginning, and because it is erupting underwater, the way it interacts with the atmosphere is different from the great volcanic catastrophes that bookend the Triassic period. The Siberian traps, which triggered the Great Dying at the start of the Triassic, erupted on land. Their gases went directly into the atmosphere. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which will trigger the end Triassic extinction in another 30 million years, also erupted largely on land. Direct atmospheric injection, vast, catastrophic, legible in the geological record as an almost instantaneous event. Wrangellia is different. When lava erupts into seawater, the dynamics change. The water absorbs heat. It absorbs gases, carbon dioxide, instead of rising immediately into the atmosphere, dissolves into the ocean first. The ocean becomes a reservoir, holding what the volcano is releasing and exchanging it with the atmosphere on timescales that are slower and more complex than direct atmospheric eruption. This is one reason why the connection between Wreckage and the climate crisis that follows it took so long to establish. The signal is there, but it is muffled. It arrives through an intermediary, and the intermediary, the ocean, has its own chemistry and its own capacity to buffer and delay and complicate what the volcano is trying to say. Here is what the geological record does tell us, clearly enough that the scientific community has come to accept it as the most plausible account of what happened. Wreckage did not erupt continuously. It erupted in pulses. 4 distinct episodes of intense volcanic activity, each separated from the next by roughly 400,000 years. Each pulse injected large quantities of carbon into the ocean atmosphere system. Each pulse was followed by measurable shifts in the chemistry of marine sediments. Shifts in temperature, recorded in the oxygen isotopes of tiny fossil teeth. Shifts in the biological communities of both the ocean and the land. 4 pulses, 4 signals in the rock. The pattern is there. The question of exactly how the mechanism worked, how much of the carbon came directly from the volcanic gases and how much came from feedback processes that the initial warming triggered, is a question that science is still working through. Conservative estimates suggest that the carbon released directly by Wreckage can account for perhaps 25% of what the isotope record requires. The rest came from somewhere else. Methane hydrates destabilized by warming ocean temperatures. Organic carbon in soils mobilized by the disruption of the water cycle. Feedbacks within the carbon cycle itself, where warming begets more warming through mechanisms that amplify the initial signal beyond what the original cause could have produced alone. The honest answer to the question of what caused the Carnian crisis is this: Wreckage started it. What happened next is more complicated than any single cause and effect chain can capture cleanly. This is the point in the story where 2 British geologists named Michael Sims and Alistair Ruffell become relevant. In 1989, they published a paper proposing that the dark sedimentary layers showing up in Carnian age rock formations across Europe, layers like the one Wolfgang Schlager had documented in the Austrian Alps 15 years earlier, were evidence of a global climate shift, a period of dramatically increased rainfall in the late Triassic, a deviation from the arid norm of Pangaea so significant that it left a readable signal in rock on multiple continents. The response from the scientific community was not enthusiasm. A prominent critique, published in 1994, argued that pollen evidence from German Carnian strata showed drought-adapted plant species remaining abundant throughout the period in question. If the climate had really shifted to dramatically wetter conditions on a global scale, the vegetation record should show it. The Sims-Ruffell hypothesis was characterized as an overreach, a regional phenomenon being inflated into a global story. Sims and Ruffell did not abandon their position, but for the better part of 2 decades, their idea existed at the margins of the field, present in the literature, not widely accepted. Meanwhile, the dark layers in the rock kept showing up, in the Italian Dolomites, in marine successions in Hungary, in lake sediments in China, in sections from Japan. Each new dataset added another data point to a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to explain as a series of local anomalies. The story of how the field eventually came to accept what Sims and Ruffell had proposed is a story worth returning to later. But the important thing for now is this: the geological signal that 2 researchers identified from rock outcrops in Europe and spent 2 decades defending against skepticism turned out to be the trace of something that had left its mark on every ocean and every continent on the planet. What Wrangellia started, the Earth amplified, and the Pangean mega-monsoon, that ancient planetary weather system built for a specific range of conditions, found itself being fed energy it was not designed to handle. There is a question that sits underneath the entire story of the Carnian crisis, and it is worth stopping to answer it directly before the narrative moves forward. How does a volcano make it rain? Not a rhetorical question, a physical one, because the connection between fire beneath the ocean floor and water falling from the sky is not obvious. And if you do not understand the mechanism, the rest of the story feels like a sequence of events rather than a system. And what happened in the Carnian was not a sequence of events. It was a system, a set of interlocking processes that drove each other forward in ways that made the whole larger and more persistent than any single cause could have produced on its own. Start with carbon dioxide. When Wrangellia erupted, it released carbon dioxide into the ocean and, through the ocean's exchange with the atmosphere, into the air. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but the specific physics of what a greenhouse gas does is worth being precise about, because the precision matters for what comes next. Carbon dioxide does not generate heat. It traps it. Solar energy arrives at the Earth's surface as shortwave radiation, warms the ground and the water, and then tries to escape back into space as longwave radiation. As heat, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere intercept that outgoing heat and redirect some of it back toward the surface. The more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the more heat is retained. The warmer the surface becomes. A warmer surface does something specific to the water cycle. Warm air holds more water vapor than cool air. This is not a complicated principle. It is the same principle that makes a summer afternoon feel humid and a winter morning feel dry. When the surface warms, more water evaporates from the oceans and the land. That water vapor rises into the atmosphere, and water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas, more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its heat-trapping capacity per molecule. Here is where the system begins to drive itself. Wrangellia adds carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide warms the surface. Warmer surface evaporates more water. More water vapor in the atmosphere traps more heat. More heat warms the surface further. More evaporation. More vapor. More warming. Climatologists call this a positive feedback loop. Each step in the chain amplifies the one before it. The initial push from the volcano does not just cause warming. It causes a warming that causes more warming, in a process that does not stop until something in the system changes enough to break the cycle. Now, place this feedback loop on Pangaea. The Panthalassa Ocean surrounding the supercontinent is already warm. The Carnian is already a hothouse period. When Wrangellia begins adding carbon dioxide to the system, it is not starting from a moderate baseline. It is pushing a system that is already running warm towards something it has not experienced before. The Pangean megamonsoon responds. Remember what the megamonsoon does. It moves moisture from the ocean onto the land in seasonal pulses. Driven by the temperature contrast between the hot continental interior and the cooler ocean surface, when the ocean warms, the monsoon is now drawing moisture from warmer water. Warmer water that is evaporating faster, releasing more moisture into the air that the monsoon circulation then carries inland. The monsoon becomes more intense. More moisture reaches the interior. Rains that previously fell only on the coastal margins begin to penetrate further inland. River systems that ran seasonally begin to run for longer periods. Lakes that were shallow and intermittent begin to deepen and persist. But here is the detail that most accounts of the Carnian crisis leave out. And it matters. This did not happen everywhere in the same way. Climate is not a uniform system. It is a collection of regional systems interacting with each other. And when you push the whole in a particular direction, different regions respond differently depending on their geography, their elevation, their position relative to the ocean and the prevailing circulation patterns. The evidence from the Carnian suggests that the increased rainfall was most pronounced along the eastern margins of Pangaea, in the regions bordering the Tethys Sea, and at higher latitudes. Parts of the western margins also became wetter. But the deep interior of the supercontinent, already the driest place on land, may in some intervals have actually become drier, as the intensified circulation patterns rearranged where moisture was being deposited without necessarily adding moisture to the places that most needed it. One climate simulation of the Carnian period describes a world where the coasts are drowning and the interior is baking, where the same system that is flooding valleys in what will become Italy is intensifying drought in what will become the heart of North America. This is not the simple story that the title of this video might suggest. It is not a world where it simply rained everywhere for 2 million years. It is a world where the water cycle broke out of its established patterns and reorganized itself along new lines, leaving some regions overwhelmed with moisture and others more starved of it than before. The organisms caught in the middle of this reorganization did not get to choose which version they were living through. They got whatever their geography gave them. There is one more element of the mechanism worth holding before the story moves to what the crisis actually did to the living world. The speed of the onset. When researchers analyzed sediment records from a lake succession in northwestern China, records that preserved the Carnian interval in unusually high resolution, they found something that surprised them. The transition from the dry conditions preceding the crisis to the dramatically wetter conditions of the crisis itself appears to have happened in approximately 15,800 years. 15,800 years sounds like a long time. In the context of a human life, it is incomprehensibly long. In the context of the geological record, where most major climate transitions are measured in hundreds of thousands or millions of years, it is nearly instantaneous. What this means for the living world of the Carnian is that the change was not gradual enough for evolutionary adaptation. Species adapt to slow change over many generations. They go extinct in the face of rapid change that outpaces the mechanisms of biological response. 15,800 years is fast. Fast enough that the organisms of the Carnian world would have experienced the change not as a background condition shifting gradually beneath them, but as a crisis arriving within what, to them, would have felt like a recognizable time frame. The system broke fast, and it broke 4 times. There is a temptation, when telling a story about a climate crisis that lasted roughly 1.5 million years, to describe it as a single sustained event, a long catastrophe, a world that tipped into a new condition and stayed there until something pushed it back. That is not what happened. What the geological record shows, when you read it carefully enough, is something more complex, and in some ways more disturbing. Not one crisis. 4 separate pulses of disruption, each one triggered by a new episode of volcanic activity from Wrangellia, each one separated from the next by a partial recovery that was never quite complete, each one arriving before the world had finished processing what the previous one had done. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions simultaneously, and the convergence of different datasets pointing at the same pattern is part of what makes the case compelling. In the carbon isotope record, the chemical signature preserved in ancient organic material in rocks from Europe, Asia, and the Americas, researchers have identified 3 to 4 distinct negative excursions. Spikes, where the ratio of carbon isotopes shifts sharply in a direction that indicates a large injection of carbon into the atmosphere and ocean. From a geological source, each excursion corresponds to a pulse of volcanic activity. Each one represents a moment when Wrangellia pushed harder, released more, and drove the climate system further from its equilibrium. In lake sediment records from the Jiyuan Basin in northern China, researchers found the same pattern expressed differently. 4 intervals where the sediment transitions from the kind of deposit you get in a stable, moderately productive lake to the kind you get when the watershed is being saturated with rainfall, when rivers are running high and fast, when organic material is being swept in from the surrounding landscape in quantities that overwhelm the lake's normal processing capacity. 4 intervals of expansion and deepening in mercury concentrations in marine and terrestrial sediments. Mercury being a reliable proxy for volcanic activity because large eruptions inject mercury into the atmosphere in quantities that leave a measurable trace in the rock record. The same pattern appears again. 4 peaks. 4 moments of elevated volcanic mercury fallout, preserved in sediments from sites spread across the planet. From Japan to Hungary to Argentina. 4 fires beneath the ocean. 4 responses in the sky. 4 marks in the rock. The spacing between the pulses, roughly 400,000 years each, is not random. It corresponds to a known cycle in the Earth's orbital geometry. The 400,000-year cycle of orbital eccentricity, the degree to which the Earth's path around the Sun deviates from a perfect circle. This cycle influences how much solar energy the Earth receives across its orbit, and it appears to have interacted with the volcanic forcing from Wrangellia in a way that amplified each pulse beyond what the volcanism alone would have produced. The planet's own orbital mechanics were adding energy to each episode of the crisis. Between the pulses, the world partially recovered. The carbon isotope record returns toward baseline. Lake levels drop. Mercury concentrations fall back. The evidence of biological disturbance in the sediment record diminishes. If you were a creature living in one of these between-pulse intervals, the world might have felt like it was stabilizing, like the worst was over. It was not over. This is the aspect of the Carnian crisis that is hardest to convey in the language of linear time. The organisms living through it did not experience it as a series of 4 discrete events with defined beginnings and endings. They experienced whatever slice of it their lifespans intersected. A rhynchosaur, living in the interval between the second and third pulse, might have spent its entire life in conditions that were somewhat wetter than the previous baseline, but not dramatically catastrophic. Its offspring might have encountered the third pulse arriving and found the world they had been born into suddenly becoming something unrecognizable. Each generation inherited a world that was slightly different from the one its parents had known. The cumulative drift of those slight differences across dozens of generations added up to an ecological transformation that no individual organism lived long enough to perceive as a whole. That is how a crisis lasting 1.5 million years works on a living population. Not as a single blow, as an accumulation of incremental displacements that individually feel survivable and collectively produce something that most of what was there before cannot survive. The first pulse hit a world that was already stressed. The recovery from the Great Dying was still incomplete 20 million years after the extinction itself. The ecological networks that had been building in the Permian had been shattered and were only partially rebuilt. The world of the Carnian was a world of simplified ecosystems. Fewer species filling each role. Thinner margins for error. When Wrangellia began its first pulse, it was pushing a system that was already running close to the edge of its tolerance. The second pulse arrived before the system had recovered from the first. The third arrived before the system had recovered from the second. By the time the fourth pulse had run its course, the world that existed on the other side of the crisis, bore almost no resemblance to the world that had existed before the first one began. Not because each individual pulse was so catastrophic in isolation, because the accumulation left no space for recovery, because resilience requires time between disturbances, and time was exactly what Wrangelia did not give the Carnian world. Before moving to what those four pulses did to the living world, there is one more thing to understand about the trap they were setting. The crisis would not destroy the old world only by making it wet. It would destroy it twice. First, by making it wet enough to dismantle the ecological structures that had organized life for millions of years. Then, by withdrawing the moisture before anything new had fully taken the wet's place. That double disruption, the wet that dismantled the old world, followed by the dry that fell on a landscape too reorganized to receive it, is what made the Carnian crisis not just a period of bad weather, but a permanent rearrangement of what was possible on this planet. The rain was the beginning of the trap. The silence after the rain was where the trap closed. The ocean does not announce what is happening to it. There is no moment of visible catastrophe. No wave large enough to be remembered. No event that any creature alive at the time could have perceived as a turning point. As the moment when the sea that had supported complex life for hundreds of millions of years began, quietly and systematically, to fail the organisms depending on it. What happens in the ocean during the Carnian crisis happens slowly, chemically, at a level of resolution that requires instruments that will not exist for another 230 million years to detect. But it happens. And the scale of what it does to marine life is large enough that a significant fraction of everything living in the sea at the start of the crisis is not living in the sea at the end of it. Start with temperature. The Panthalassa and the Tethys Sea, the two great ocean bodies of the Triassic world, are already warm before Wrangelia begins its work. But as the carbon dioxide load in the atmosphere increases through the four pulses of volcanic activity, the ocean surface warms further. The oxygen isotope record, preserved in conodont apatite, the tiny phosphatic teeth of small eel-like creatures that lived throughout the Triassic Ocean and left their hard parts in the sediment in enormous quantities, tells us this with reasonable precision. Ocean surface temperatures during the Carnian crisis rose by somewhere between 3 and 8 degrees Celsius above the already elevated Carnian baseline. 3 to 8 degrees does not sound like much. It is worth spending a moment with what it actually means for ocean biology. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. This is basic chemistry. The same principle that makes a cold glass of water feel more refreshing than a warm one on a hot day. As ocean temperatures rise, the oxygen content of the water drops. The surface layers, which exchange directly with the atmosphere, maintain enough oxygen for the organisms living there. But as you descend into deeper water, where the exchange with the atmosphere is limited and where oxygen is being consumed by biological processes without being replenished from above, the available oxygen falls toward levels that are incompatible with aerobic life. Dead zones form. Not dead in the dramatic sense of a sudden mass die-off visible from the surface. Dead in the chemical sense of a volume of water where the oxygen concentration has dropped below the threshold that most complex animals require to maintain their metabolism. Where anything that cannot move fast enough to escape the anoxic water simply stops functioning and sinks to the bottom. The sediment record from the Carnian preserves this in a form that geologists can read directly. Dark, organic, rich layers. The same kind of dark layer that Wolfgang Schlager found in the Austrian Alps, appear in marine successions across the period of the crisis. These layers form when organic material accumulates on the seafloor faster than it can be broken down by oxygen-dependent decomposers. They are the geological signature of a seafloor, where the normal processing of dead material has been disrupted by the absence of the oxygen that processing requires. The dark layers are, in a literal sense, the compressed remains of things that died in water that could no longer support their survival. But temperature and oxygen are only part of what the crisis does to the ocean. There is a third mechanism, and it is the one that produces the most legible signal in the geological record. The carbonate platforms collapse. For most of the Triassic preceding the crisis, the shallow seas of the Tethys and the margins of the Panthalassa are dominated by carbonate platforms. Massive structures of calcium carbonate built by corals, brachiopods, crinoids, and a host of other calcifying organisms over millions of years of continuous biological activity. These platforms are the Triassic equivalent of modern reef systems, the biological infrastructure of the shallow ocean. When the crisis arrives, the carbonate platforms stop growing. The geological record captures this as a boundary that is difficult to miss once you know what you are looking at. Below the boundary, carbonate, limestone, pale and thick, the accumulated product of millions of years of biological calcification. At the boundary, the carbonate stops. Above it, mud, dough, siliciclastic sediment, the product of intensified continental weathering and runoff carried into the sea by rivers, swollen by the increased rainfall on land. This is the layer that Schlager found in 1974. This is the signal that Sims and Ruffle identified in 1989. The transition from carbonate to mud is not a local curiosity. It is a planetary boundary marker, readable in rock formations, from the Alps to the Dolomites, to sections in China and Japan, and across the former margins of the Tethys Sea. Warmer water stresses the organisms that build carbonate structures, more acidic water. The result of carbon dioxide dissolving into the ocean and forming carbonic acid makes it harder for organisms to build and maintain calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. The chemistry of calcification becomes more energetically costly. And in a stressed ecosystem where energy budgets are already tight, the organisms that cannot afford that cost are eliminated. And then there is the runoff. The increased rainfall on land during the crisis means increased chemical weathering of rocks. This flood of terrestrial material changes the chemistry of the nearshore water in ways that further stress carbonate-building communities. The shallow seas become murkier. Light penetration, which many carbonate-building organisms depend on for the photosynthetic partners living in their tissues, decreases. The conditions that the carbonate platforms required to function are dismantled from multiple directions simultaneously. When researchers conducted a systematic analysis of the marine fossil record across the Carnian interval, the numbers that emerged were significant enough that the Carnian crisis is now sometimes described as a mass extinction event, though one that does not quite reach the scale of the 5 major extinctions that dominate the popular understanding of extinction history. Approximately 1/3 of all marine genera present before the crisis cannot be found in the fossil record after it. Not the 90% that the Great Dying achieved. Not the 75% of the End Cretaceous event. But 1 in 3 of every broad category of marine life that existed before the crisis is absent from the world that exists after it. Ammonoids suffer severe losses. Conodonts are hit hard enough that their diversity never fully recovers before their eventual extinction at the end of the Triassic. Crinoids see their communities decimated. The brachiopods that had built carbonate reefs alongside corals across the Triassic seafloor are dramatically reduced. The ocean that exists after the Carnian crisis is a simpler ocean than the one that existed before it. Fewer species, thinner ecological networks, more mud where there had been carbonate. more open space where there had been structure. But within that emptiness, something is already beginning. New coral lineages, the ones that will eventually build the reef systems of the modern ocean, begin to establish themselves in the wake of the carbonate collapse. New plankton groups begin to fill the water column. New ammonoid lineages diversify into the ecological space left by the extinction of their predecessors. The ocean is being cleared, and clearing, in ecology as in other contexts, makes room for what comes next. What comes next, on land, is even more consequential. The land does not respond to the Carnian crisis the way the ocean does. The ocean has a chemistry. You change the chemistry. You change what can live in it. And the record of what lived and what did not is preserved with reasonable clarity in the sediment on the seafloor. The story is legible, if not simple. The land is messier. The terrestrial fossil record is always patchier than the marine record, because bones and wood and leaf impressions require very specific conditions to be preserved. Conditions that are less common on land than on a seafloor where sediment is continuously accumulating. What we can read from the Carnian terrestrial record is real and significant, but it requires more caution than the marine story. More acknowledgement of what we cannot see alongside what we can. With that said, what the terrestrial record does show is clear enough to be worth taking seriously. The world that existed before the Carnian crisis was organized around a specific set of ecological relationships. Rhynchosaurs dominated the large herbivore niches. Dicynodonts occupied the largest body size categories among herbivores. Atosaurs and Rauisuchians filled the predator roles. The small, bipedal, fast-moving animals at the edges of these systems, the early dinosaurs and their close relatives, were present but not important. Not yet. That organization begins to break down during the Carnian crisis. And it breaks down in ways that are instructive precisely because they are not straightforward. Begin with the rhynchosaurs. Rhynchosaurs are herbivores with a very specific dietary apparatus. Their beaked skulls and complex tooth batteries are specialized for processing particular kinds of vegetation, primarily the fleshy seeds of a plant group called the Dicroidium flora, which had been widespread across the southern portion of Pangaea during the Triassic. They are, in the ecological language of specialization, highly adapted to a specific food source in a specific kind of environment. When the Carnian crisis arrives and begins reorganizing the vegetation of the world they live in, the problem for rhynchosaurs is not that the rain kills them. Rain does not kill rhynchosaurs. The problem is that the rain kills their food. The vegetation turnover during the Carnian crisis is substantial. The increased rainfall, the flooding of previously arid regions, the waterlogging of soils that had been dry for millions of years, fundamentally restructures what plants can grow where. The Dicroidium flora, which had thrived in the semi-arid conditions of the Triassic, finds itself competing with and being replaced by plant communities better adapted to wetter conditions. Conifers diversify dramatically during the crisis interval. Ferns expand. The entire composition of the plant world shifts toward taxa that benefit from the increased moisture. The rhynchosaurs, built for the world that existed before this shift, find themselves in a world where their specific dietary specialization is increasingly a liability. Highly specialized organisms are, in general, well adapted to stable conditions and poorly adapted to rapid change. The more precisely an organism is tuned to a specific set of conditions, the more vulnerable it is when those conditions are altered. Rhynchosaur diversity collapses during the Carnian crisis. Not immediately, not in a single generation, but progressively across the interval of the disturbance. By the time the crisis has run its course, rhynchosaurs are reduced from the dominant large herbivores of the Triassic world to a group approaching extinction. They will not recover. The Triassic ends with rhynchosaurs effectively gone, and no lineage descended from them will carry forward into the Jurassic. The dicynodonts follow a different trajectory, but arrive at a similar destination. They are more generalized feeders than rhynchosaurs, and this generalism gives them more flexibility in the face of changing conditions. But they too are reduced. Their diversity decreases across the Carnian interval. Their geographic range contracts, and the large dicynodont presence that had characterized the earlier Triassic becomes increasingly thin by the time the crisis is over. Now here is where the story requires the most careful telling, because the popular version of what happens next tends toward a narrative of heroic emergence that the evidence does not fully support. And the actual story is more interesting than the heroic version anyway. Dinosaurs do not rise during the Carnian crisis because they are better. That framing imposes a logic of competition and superiority on a situation that was primarily driven by ecological disruption and opportunism rather than direct competitive displacement. The rhynchosaurs did not lose a fair fight with the dinosaurs. They lost their food source and their ecological niche, and the space they vacated became available to whatever organisms could occupy it. What made dinosaurs capable of occupying that space is a question with several answers. Bipedal locomotion frees the forelimbs for uses other than walking. Erect posture, with the limbs positioned directly beneath the body rather than sprawling to the sides, is more energetically efficient for sustained movement. Some researchers argue that dinosaurs had metabolic rates higher than the typical reptilian baseline of the period, giving them greater capacity for sustained activity and faster growth rates than their competitors. Whether any of these advantages was directly decisive during the Carnian crisis is genuinely uncertain. What the fossil record shows is not a moment of competitive victory. It shows a before and an after. But here is what the fossil record also shows. And this is the part that most accounts of the Carnian crisis do not fully reckon with. The crisis did not destroy the Old World only by making it wet. The crisis destroyed the Old World twice. First, the rain arrived. The wet dismantled the ecological structures that had organized the Triassic world for millions of years. The rhynchosaurs lost their food. The carbonate platforms collapsed. The old configurations of who ate what and who depended on whom were taken apart piece by piece across 1.5 million years of disruption. And then, in the space where those structures had been, new configurations began to form. New plant communities adapted to the wetter conditions. New ecological relationships organizing around the species that had survived and expanded during the wet interval. A new world, not fully built yet, not fully stabilized, but taking shape in the increased moisture of the crisis period. Then the moisture went away, not gradually, not with sufficient warning for the new configurations to complete themselves and harden into something resilient. The end of the crisis, like its beginning, was fast by geological standards. The volcanic forcing stopped. The feedback loops that had been amplifying the warming began to run in reverse. The hydrological cycle contracted back toward the more arid conditions that characterized the Triassic baseline. The world went dry again, but it was not the same dryness that it had been before. The organisms that had been adapted to the pre-crisis aridity were gone or severely diminished. The new world that the wet interval had been building was not yet complete when the wet ended, and the dry that followed fell on a landscape that was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely open in the ecological sense of a system where the niches that previously organized who ate what and who dominated where were no longer filled by the organisms that had previously filled them. This is the double trap that the Carnian crisis set and closed. The wet took down the old world. The dry arrived before the new world could replace it. And in the gap between those two destructions, the ecological space that had been accumulating for 1.5 million years was suddenly, irrevocably available. Michael Benton, a paleontologist at the University of Bristol who has worked extensively on the biological consequences of the Carnian crisis, has noted that dinosaurs originated roughly 20 million years before the crisis and remained ecologically marginal throughout that interval. It was the sudden arid conditions after the humid episode, not the humid episode itself, that gave dinosaurs their chance, not the rain. What came after the rain, into the open landscape left by the double disruption? The dinosaurs expanded, not because they had been waiting, not because they had some foreknowledge of the opportunity that was coming, because their body plan, which had been a minor variation on the archosaur theme for 20 million years without ever becoming ecologically dominant, happened to be well suited to exploiting a landscape in flux. They were not the only group to benefit. Crocodilomorphs expanded. Lepidosaurs diversified. The first mammalia forms appear in the fossil record around this time. Small and nocturnal and occupying the marginal ecological roles that the larger fauna left available, what the crisis created was not a dinosaur world specifically. It created an open world, and multiple lineages moved into the opening simultaneously. What distinguished the dinosaurs was what they did with the opening over the subsequent tens of millions of years. The versatility of the dinosaur body plan, its capacity to be modified in many different directions by subsequent evolution, allowed the lineage to expand into an extraordinary range of ecological roles. Small predators and enormous predators, animals the size of a sparrow and animals the size of a building, obligate carnivores and obligate herbivores, and eventually animals that flew. That radiation did not happen overnight. It happened across the remaining 180 million years of the Mesozoic, driven by evolutionary processes that the crisis set in motion but did not complete. The crisis created the opening. Evolution filled it, one generation at a time, in ways that no organism living through any part of the process could have predicted or perceived as a whole. There is a place in Argentina called the Valle de la Luna, the Valley of the Moon. The name comes from the landscape itself, which does not look like anything a living world should produce. Badlands of red and purple clay, eroded by wind and occasional water into formations that have no obvious analogy in the vocabulary of ordinary terrain. Spires and ridges and hollows carved into shapes that seem almost deliberate, as though something had been working on them with a specific intention that it never quite finished carrying out. The sky above is enormous and very blue. The ground is the color of old brick, of dried blood, of the particular red that iron oxide produces when it has been sitting in sunlight for a very long time. Today, the Valle de la Luna is a national park in the San Juan province of northwestern Argentina. Tourists come to photograph the formations at sunset, when the light turns everything a deeper shade of red, and the shadows make the landscape look briefly like somewhere else entirely. 231 million years ago. It was a floodplain, not a floodplain in the dramatic sense of a landscape regularly inundated by large rivers, a Triassic floodplain, which means something more intermittent, more seasonal, more dependent on the rainfall patterns of the Carnian world than on a permanent water source. Rivers ran through it when the rains came. They slowed and narrowed, and sometimes stopped when the rains did not. Forests of primitive conifers and tree ferns lined the river corridors where the water table was high enough to support them. Away from the rivers, The vegetation thinned. The red of the soil showed through. This landscape sits in the geological record as the Ixigualasto Formation, one of the most important fossil-bearing rock units in South America. Precisely because the sediments that accumulated on that ancient floodplain preserved, in extraordinary detail, the bones of the animals that lived and died there across several million years of the late Triassic. Among those animals, discovered in 1996 by an Argentine paleontologist named Ricardo Martinez and a volunteer named Jim Murphy, is the one this chapter is about. Eodromaeus murphy, the dawn runner. Its holotype specimen, the fossil that defines the species and against which all other specimens are compared, is a nearly complete, articulated skeleton recovered from the Valle de la Luna, member of the Ixigualasto Formation. Nearly complete and articulated means something specific in paleontology. It means the bones were still in their anatomical positions when the animal was buried. It means the carcass was not significantly disturbed by scavengers or by water transport before it was covered by sediment. It means that, whatever happened to this animal, at the end of its life, it came to rest in a place where the conditions were right for preservation. And it stayed there. It stayed there for 231 million years. When Martinez and Murphy uncovered it, they initially thought they had found a new specimen of Eoraptor, another early dinosaur, known from the same formation. The two animals were similar in size and general body plan. Similar enough that the distinction between them required more than a field assessment. It was only after years of detailed preparation and comparative analysis, work that was not published until 2011, that Eodromaeus was recognized as a separate genus with its own distinct position in the early dinosaur family tree. What that position turned out to be made the discovery significantly more important than a new species of a known genus would have been. Paul Sereno, the University of Chicago paleontologist who led the analysis, described Eodromaeus as resembling what you would predict the common ancestor of all dinosaurs to look like, not the ancestor itself, which is lost to the incompleteness of the fossil record, but an animal close enough to that hypothetical ancestor that its anatomy illuminates what the earliest stage of dinosaur evolution actually looked like before the lineage split into the major groups. The animal itself, setting aside its phylogenetic significance for a moment, is worth simply describing. It is small, 1.2 meters from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail, which is roughly the length of a large dog, but much lighter, 5 to 7 kilograms. The skeleton is built for speed in a way that is immediately legible even in fossil form. The hind limbs are long relative to the body. The feet are narrow, with the weight concentrated on the outer digits in a way that reduces the contact area with the ground and increases the efficiency of each stride. The tail is long and held horizontally, functioning as a counterbalance that allows rapid changes of direction without the animal losing its footing. Among the 23 Triassic archosaurs that one biomechanical study assessed for running adaptations, Eodromaeus ranked second. Only one other animal in its world was better built for speed. It ran at an estimated 32 kilometers per hour, in a world where most of the large animals moved with the measured deliberateness of creatures that did not need to hurry because nothing faster was hunting them. That speed was remarkable. The skull is low and rectangular, about 12 centimeters long. The teeth are sharp and recurved. The teeth of a predator, designed for gripping prey rather than processing plant material. Eodromaeus atemit, small prey, almost certainly, given its own small size. Insects, small reptiles, the juveniles of larger animals, whatever it could catch and hold and kill, with a skull and jaw apparatus designed for exactly that. Now place this animal in its world. The Ishigualasto Formation dates to approximately 231 to 230 million years ago. The Carnian pluvial episode, the core of the crisis, is generally placed at 234 to 232 million years ago. Eodromeus lives in the aftermath, in the world that the crisis built. This is the distinction that matters for understanding what Eodromeus represents in this story. It is not a creature of the storm. It is a creature of the world after the storm passed and the double trap closed and the ecological landscape was left open in a way it had not been for millions of years. The floodplain it runs across, the river corridors lined with conifers, the red soil of the Valle de la Luna. These are the products of the ecological reorganization that the Carnian crisis set in motion. The vegetation communities of the Ishigualasto Formation reflect the diversification of conifers and other plant groups that accelerated during and immediately after the crisis. The animal communities of the formation reflect the reduction of rhynchosaurs and dicynodonts and the opening of ecological space that the crisis produced. Eodromeus inherits this world. It does not create it. It does not deserve it in any moral sense. It is simply the kind of animal that the new configuration of ecological possibility selected for. Vast, generalist in its hunting strategy, efficient in its locomotion, equipped with a body plan that could be scaled up or modified in many different directions by subsequent evolution, a versatility that the lineages that declined during the crisis did not possess to the same degree. The Ishigualasto Formation is not a paradise. It is a recovering world, still in the process of finding its new equilibrium. Dinosaur fossils still represent only a fraction of the total vertebrate fauna. Herrerasaurus, a larger and more powerful predatory dinosaur, is present and more common than Eodromeus. Rhynchosaurs are still there, though diminished. The old world has not been fully replaced. It is being replaced, slowly, in the accumulation of small advantages and incremental changes that eventually produce a recognizably different outcome. Eodromeus moves through this transitional world without knowing what it is transitioning toward. It does not know that the lineage it belongs to will eventually produce Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus and Velociraptor through the particular branch that will eventually lead to birds. Every species of feathered creature alive on Earth today. It does not know that the world being built around it in the aftermath of the Carnian crisis will last for another 150 million years before the next major disruption arrives. It knows its territory. The stretch of riverbank where the conifers thin and the ground opens up and the small reptiles that constitute most of its diet are abundant in the early morning. The seasonal rhythms of the floodplain, when the rivers run and when they do not, when food is plentiful, and when it requires more effort to find. The holotype specimen of Eodromeus is currently housed at the Instituto y Museo de Ciencias Naturales in San Juan, Argentina. It is a small skeleton, light bones, gracile construction, the kind of fossil that does not immediately command the visual attention of the larger, more dramatic specimens that fill the popular imagination of what fossil dinosaurs look like. But it is from approximately 231 million years ago. It is from the immediate aftermath of the crisis that reshaped the terrestrial world. And it is, in the careful assessment of the researchers who have studied it most closely, close to what the ancestor of every dinosaur that ever lived would have looked like. Every dinosaur that ever lived, every feathered species alive today, the 10,000 or so species of birds that occupy every continent and every ecological niche from the Arctic tundra to the equatorial rainforest, carries in its body plan the inheritance of something that looked, in its essential architecture, like this: a small animal, vast, running on two legs across a red floodplain in Argentina, in a world still settling into the new configuration that a climate crisis had forced upon it. The morning it inhabited is gone. The world it ran through is gone. The floodplain is now a badlands. The rivers are now dry formations in ancient rock. The conifers that lined the riverbanks are now impressions in sediment. What is not gone is the line, the unbroken chain of generations that runs from that floodplain morning to every bird alive today. A line that passes through the crisis that created the opportunity, through the diversification that filled the opportunity, through 150 million years of Mesozoic dominance, through the extinction that ended it, and through the particular small lineage that survived that extinction and kept running. The dawn runner did not know it was at the beginning of something. It was just running. It kept running, and the world it was running through kept changing. Recovery is not the right word for what that change was. It implies a return to something, a restoration of what was lost, a reversion to the state that existed before the disruption. Recovery suggests that the goal of the process is the previous condition, and that success means arriving back at the starting point. What happened to the Earth in the wake of the Carnian crisis was not recovery in that sense. What happened was reconstruction, the building of something genuinely new from the biological materials that survived the disruption, organized according to configurations that had not previously existed, producing a world that resembled the pre-crisis world in some ways and differed from it in ways that would define the next 200 million years of life on this planet. The distinction matters because it changes what the story is about. If the story is about recovery, the Carnian crisis is an interruption, a deviation from a trajectory that eventually resumes. If the story is about reconstruction, the crisis is a hinge, the event around which the entire direction of life on land and in the sea pivots towards something it would not otherwise have become. Begin with the plants, because the plants are the foundation of everything else. The vegetation communities of the post-crisis world are not the vegetation communities of the pre-crisis world, with some species missing. They are organized differently, dominated by different groups, shaped by the evolutionary diversification that the crisis itself accelerated. Conifers, which had been present throughout the Triassic, but had not achieved the kind of broad ecological dominance they would later hold, diversify enormously during and immediately after the crisis interval. New conifer lineages establish themselves across a range of environments that previously supported different plant communities. The ancestors of the pine and cypress and Araucaria families that will define Mesozoic forests take their positions in the ecological landscape during this period. The reason is not mysterious. Conifers have a set of characteristics that prove advantageous in the disturbed, variable conditions of the crisis and post-crisis world. Their seeds are enclosed in protective structures that can survive periods of drought. Their root systems are adaptable to a range of soil moisture conditions. They are, in the vocabulary of ecological succession, good colonizers of disturbed ground. The crisis created an enormous amount of disturbed ground. The conifers filled it in the ocean. The reconstruction was slower and in some ways more difficult. The carbonate platforms that collapsed during the crisis did not simply rebuild themselves when the conditions that had stressed them were removed. The organisms that had built those platforms were too reduced in diversity and abundance to resume their former role quickly. What fills the space left by the collapsed carbonate system is initially simpler: opportunistic organisms, generalist feeders, species with wide environmental tolerances that can survive the variability of a disrupted system, even if they cannot build the complex structure that the previous community had created. But within that simplicity, something important is happening. New coral lineages, different from the corals that dominated the pre-crisis carbonate platforms, begin to establish themselves in the shallow seas of the post-crisis world. These scleractinian corals, which had existed before the crisis in small numbers and ecological insignificance, find in the cleared carbonate landscape an opportunity that the previous dominance of other calcifying organisms had denied them. They begin to build, slowly, incrementally, in the particular way that coral reefs are built, one organism at a time, one calcium carbonate skeleton layered on top of the one before it. Every coral reef that exists today traces its origins to the ecological opening that the Carnian crisis created in the shallow marine world. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline. It describes the way that each generation tends to take the conditions it grew up with as the normal state of the world, even when those conditions are themselves the product of changes from an earlier normal. The Carnian crisis represents a baseline shift of geological magnitude. Every organism that lived through the crisis and survived it took the post-crisis world as its baseline. Every organism that evolved in the aftermath of the crisis had no reference point for the world that had existed before. The Rinchasaur world, the Dicynodont world, the carbonate platform world of the Triassic was simply the past, not a lost paradise, not a remembered alternative, just gone, in the way that things go when the conditions that sustained them are removed and enough time passes that the memory, if biological communities could be said to have memories, is no longer recoverable. What came after was not a recovery of what had been lost. It was the world that grew in the space where the old world used to be, and it lasted, in its various configurations and evolutionary expressions, for 200 million years. There is a mountain range in northeastern Italy that does not look like it belongs to the same planet as the rest of the Alps. The Alps, taken as a whole, are a limestone range, grey and white and silver, the product of ancient seafloor sediment compressed and uplifted over millions of years of tectonic collision. They are beautiful in the way that large, austere things are beautiful, imposing, cold at altitude, the kind of landscape that commands respect without inviting you to linger. The Dolomites are different. The rock here is pale yellow and pink, and occasionally a deep amber that turns almost red in the hours before sunset. The formations rise from the valley floors in vertical walls that look less like mountains than like the ruins of something much larger that has been partially disassembled. Towers and buttresses and sheer faces that drop hundreds of meters to the scree below. In the evening, when the light comes in at a low angle from the west, the pale rock catches it and holds it in a way that limestone does not, glowing from within in a phenomenon that locals call the enrosadira, the alpenglow, a word for the specific quality of light that these specific rocks produce at this specific time of day. What this rock actually is a story. The Dolomites are named for Dolomieu, the French geologist who first described the unusual mineral composition of the rock in the late 18th century. But the mineralogy is not the story. The story is in the layering. If you know what to look for, and if you find the right outcrop in the right valley, you can see it with your own eyes without any instrumentation more sophisticated than the ability to distinguish light rock from dark below a certain horizon. The rock is carbonate, pale, thick, uniform, the product of millions of years of biological calcification in the warm, shallow seas of the Triassic world. Above that horizon, for a relatively thin interval, the rock changes character, darker, silica-rich, the kind of sediment that accumulates when the biological machinery producing carbonate has shut down and terrestrial runoff is filling the space with something different. And then, above the dark interval, the carbonate resumes. Different carbonate, built by different organisms on a reorganized seafloor. But carbonate nonetheless. That thin dark interval is the Carnian pluvial episode, written in rock. It is the same signal that Wolfgang Schlager documented in the Austrian Alps in 1974, the same signal that Michael Sims and Alastair Ruffell proposed in 1989 as evidence of a global climate event. The same signal that a prominent critique in 1994 argued was a regional artifact rather than a global phenomenon. The same signal that accumulated across dozens of study sites on 4 continents over 2 decades until the scientific community at a workshop in Bolzano in 2008, a city at the northern edge of the Dolomites themselves, acknowledged that the hypothesis was correct. The workshop happened close to some of the best exposed Carnian sections in the world. The scientists who had spent years arguing about whether a global climate event had occurred in the Carnian could walk out of the conference room and into the valley and look at the evidence directly. It is worth pausing on what the 19-year gap between Sims and Ruffell's 1989 paper and the 2008 workshop actually represents, not as a criticism of the scientists involved, most of whom were operating in good faith, with the evidence available to them, but as an illustration of how scientific knowledge about deep time actually advances. The Carnian pluvial episode left its signal in rock on every continent. That signal was there in the 1980s, when Sims and Ruffell first proposed their hypothesis. It was there in the 1990s, when critics argued against them. It did not change between those 2 decades. The rock did not alter its chemistry to resolve the dispute. What changed was the number of sites studied, the resolution of the dating methods applied to those sites, the development of geochemical proxies that could read past climate conditions from the chemistry of ancient sediment with a precision that was not available to the earlier researchers, and the slow accumulation of a dataset large enough that the pattern could no longer be explained away as regional noise. Science about deep time works this way. The events being studied are fixed. They happened or they did not happen. And the evidence they left in the rock is the evidence they left. No more and no less. What changes is the human capacity to read that evidence, the tools available for reading it, and the willingness to revise previous conclusions when new data requires revision. Sims and Ruffell were right in 1989. The field was not ready to accept it in 1989, not because of bad faith, but because the evidence that would make the case undeniable had not yet been assembled. Assembling it took 30 years, and the work of researchers on multiple continents who were often not coordinating directly with each other, simply working on the Carnian rock formations available to them in their own regions and publishing what they found. The convergence of those separate research programs into a coherent global picture is one of the quieter success stories of modern paleoclimatology. It does not have the drama of a single breakthrough or a decisive experiment. It has the particular satisfaction of a pattern becoming visible slowly. The way a photograph develops, detail accumulating until the image is clear enough that you cannot imagine having failed to see it. In the Dolomites today, the boundary is visible. You can stand in front of it. You can put your hand on the carbonate below and then move it upward to the dark layer and then upward again to the carbonate above. Below your hand at the start, a world of rhynchosaurs and dry plains and carbonate seas, a world that had been organizing itself for tens of millions of years around the particular conditions of the Triassic. Under your hand in the middle, the crisis. 1.5 million years of disruption compressed into a layer you could cover with your palm. Above your hand at the end, the beginning of the Mesozoic world. The world of the dawn runners and the reconstructed ocean and the conifer forests that will eventually shade the largest animals to ever walk on land. The transition from one to the other is preserved in a layer of dark rock thin enough to step over. In the rock layers below that dark boundary, the layers that represent the world before the crisis, there are no dinosaur footprints. The sediment of those layers preserves footprints. It preserves the traces of animals moving across wet ground. Below the boundary, the footprints belong to the animals of the pre-crisis world. Rhinoceros, atosaurs, the archosaurs that dominated before the disruption. At the boundary, the dark layer, the carbonate stops. The mud begins. Above the boundary, dinosaur footprints appear, not gradually, not in a slow accumulation across many rock layers. They appear suddenly, abundant, as though a door opened. Below the dark layer, no dinosaurs. Above it, dinosaurs everywhere. The dark layer that Wolfgang Schlager noticed in 1974 in the Austrian Alps, the layer that Sims and Ruffel proposed in 1989 as evidence of a global climate event. The layer whose significance the field spent 30 years establishing is not just a chemical signal in the rock. It is a door. On one side, the world organized around the rhynchosaurs and the dicynodonts and the carbonate seas and the arid rhythms of the Pangaean megamonsoon. On the other side, the world being built by the dawn runners. Here is what we know. 234 million years ago, a volcanic province beneath the floor of the Panthalassa Ocean began erupting in pulses. The carbon it released, amplified by feedback processes that are still not fully understood, drove the climate of a supercontinent into a state it had not occupied before. The rain that followed was not uniform and not continuous and not the simple global deluge that the title of this story might have suggested when you first encountered it. It was a reorganization of the water cycle, expressed differently in different regions, arriving in 4 distinct episodes across 1.5 million years, dismantling the ecological architecture of the Triassic world piece by piece. Then the rain stopped, and the dry that followed fell on a landscape too reorganized to receive it the way the old world had. The old world was dismantled by the wet. The new world was not yet complete when the wet ended. In the gap between those two destructions, the ecological space that had been accumulating for 1.5 million years was suddenly available. 1/3 of all marine genera disappeared. The carbonate platforms collapsed. The rhynchosaurs lost their food source and moved steadily toward extinction. The dicynodonts were reduced. And in the ecological space that opened on the other side of all of that, a small, fast animal running on 2 legs across a red floodplain in Argentina found a world that was, for the first time in the history of its lineage, genuinely open to what it might become. We know that the dark layer in the Dolomites is real. We know that the signal in the carbon isotopes is real. We know that the biological turnover is real. We know that the workshop in Bolzano in 2008 marked the moment when the scientific community formally acknowledged what 2 researchers had proposed in 1989 and spent nearly 2 decades defending against skepticism. We know that the world on one side of the Carnian boundary and the world on the other side of it are different in ways that are not incidental. The difference between them is the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs. 150 million years of a particular configuration of life on this planet. That is what we know. Here is what we do not know and cannot know, and what no amount of additional data from any rock formation on any continent will ever be able to tell us. What would have happened if Wrangell had not erupted? Not as a rhetorical gesture, as a genuine question about the contingency of the history of life, about how much of what exists today is the product of specific events that did not have to happen and could easily, in a slightly different configuration of geological circumstance, not have happened at all. The rhinoceros. In the world without Wrangellia. Continue. They are, by every measure available in the early Carnian, a successful lineage, diverse, widespread, ecologically dominant, with no obvious internal reason to decline. In a world where the climate crisis does not arrive, there is no particular reason to expect them to stop being what they are. The dicynodonts continue. The carbonate platforms of the Tethys and the margins of the Panthalassa continue building. The ecological structure of the Triassic world continues to develop along whatever trajectory it was on before the disruption arrived. And the dinosaurs, small and fast and ecologically marginal, continue to be small and fast and ecologically marginal. They had been present for 20 million years without achieving the kind of ecological expansion that the post-crisis world would eventually allow. If the body plan and the metabolic advantages attributed to early dinosaurs were sufficient on their own to drive the lineage to dominance, 20 million years seems like enough time for that to have happened. It did not happen, not until the crisis cleared the way, which means that everything downstream of the dinosaur radiation is contingent on 4 pulses of a volcano beneath the Panthalassa Ocean that did not have to happen when they happened. In the magnitude they happened, in the configuration that drove the climate system across the threshold it crossed, follow that contingency far enough and you arrive at a place that science cannot go. A place where the only honest response is to acknowledge the question and stop before the answer becomes something other than science. If the Mesozoic is contingent on Wrangellia, then the end Cretaceous extinction that cleared the dinosaurs and opened the ecological space for mammals is contingent on Wrangellia. The mammalian radiation of the Cenozoic is contingent on Wrangellia. The primates are contingent on Wrangellia. The particular lineage of primates that eventually developed the cognitive capacity to stand in front of a rock face in the Austrian Alps in 1974 and notice a dark layer of sediment and wonder what it meant is contingent on Wrangellia. Wolfgang Schlager stood at that rock face and wrote down a name for something he did not understand. He could not have known that the dark layer he was describing was the signature of the event that made it possible for him to be standing there at all. That the crisis preserved in that few centimeters of sediment was part of the chain of contingencies that produced 230 million years later. A human being with a specific kind of mind capable of asking why a layer of rock does not belong. The chain that connects that volcanic province beneath the Panthalassa to the question you are sitting with right now is real. Each link in it is supported by evidence. The logic is not a fantasy. But here is where the chain leads, somewhere the rock cannot follow. If Wrangellia had not erupted, or had erupted differently, or had erupted at a different time, would this question exist at all? Would something else have eventually produced a creature capable of asking it? Would a rhynchosaur world, given enough time and enough evolutionary pressure, have found its own path to the kind of biological complexity that the dinosaur radiation and its aftermath eventually produced? Science does not know. Science cannot know. The counterfactual history of a planet is not something that any fossil record can preserve, because the fossils that would tell us what happened in the alternative version of events do not exist. They cannot exist. The only history that leaves evidence is the history that actually occurred. What actually occurred is this: a creature that looks, in its essential architecture, like the ancestor of every dinosaur that ever lived, ran across a red floodplain in Argentina 231 million years ago, in the aftermath of a crisis it did not cause and could not have understood. It left no record of its passage except its bones, which fell into river sediment and were compressed and mineralized across geological time and discovered by 2 people in 1996 who spent more than a decade working out what they had found. The dark layer in the Dolomites is a few centimeters thick. 230 million years of everything that followed is on the other side of it, whether something like what followed would have followed anyway. In the absence of the four pulses that created the dark layer is the question that the rock holds in its chemistry without answering. You can stand in front of that rock face and put your hand on the boundary between the two worlds. The rock will not tell you what it knows. It will only show you where the door was. And on the other side of that door, something ran,